And William is really great. He told another great story.
Actually, I got to know Margaret Thatcher when I was in the Reagan administration, and I can absolutely see her saying that and being a complete put down of the poor representative from Surrey.
Yeah, and even people that love Margaret, that looked up to Margaret, that were inspired by Margaret, like the Right Honorable William Hague. He tells a hilarious story, and he was also a big fan of Ronald Reagan. He tells a story that basically Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Gorbachev all pass away. And obviously this is just a joke. And Gorbachev comes to God first, and Gorbachev says, God, I deserve to be treated well. I ended communism in a totalitarian state in Russia, and I benefited the Russian people and the world, including the United States. And God says, okay, that's fair enough. Take the seat directly next to me, my left seat. Ronald Reagan next comes, and President Reagan says, God, I'm a religious man. I've brought capitalism, I'm a capitalist, and I brought prosperity to the United States. And God says, I couldn't agree with you more. Take the seat directly to my right. Then next Prime Minister Thatcher comes, and Prime Minister Thatcher says to God, God, you're sitting in my seat.
I got to tell you, I was at a dinner with Margaret Thatcher in London after she was Prime Minister, and there were about a dozen people at the dinner. My husband was invited, as were all the, and he's an American, but there were a number of British people who had worked for her in various capacities, and all pretty household names. And the organizer of the dinner said, well, we can't just have Margaret Thatcher alone, we need to have another woman, so they invited me. So I go, it's black tie evening at the Ritz in London, and so we walk in, and Margaret Thatcher looks around, and she looks at me and says, what are you doing here? I don't need you. At which point I sort of slinked away. Now, Margaret Thatcher at this point was no longer Prime Minister, and she and her husband were there, Jeremy Thatcher, and the two of them had a lot to drink. They were having a really good time. These were her old assistants, her old aides, and they were all thought she just walked on water. So at the end of the evening, everyone sat after the dinner, everybody was giving speeches. And so every one of them, all sort of 12 of these guys got up and said, you know, Lady Thatcher, you really changed the course of British history. One of them was the one who deregulated governments, and the other one was the Baron who had taken public industries and turned them into private. And they were all, you know, really, and she was asleep. She'd heard it all before. It was a long night. She'd had a couple of drinks, so she just fell back, and her head was back on her chair. And I'm sorry to say that she was actually snoring. Nobody knew what to do. What do you wake her up? I mean, it was her turn to talk at the end. At the end, the host of the evening said, and now, Lady Thatcher, we all raise our glasses to you. At which point her head snapped forward, she stood up regally, and she looked around at all these men, and she said, every one of you, all I needed, I knew I just needed a few good men, and I could change the course of British history and world history. And then she went one by one and told them how important they were. They were stunned. They'd just been listening to her snore, and here she was telling them they were the leaders of the world. They'd saved the free world. She then promptly sat down and went back to sleep. It was the most amazing performance of any political leader I've ever seen. So I could see how well she would do under your environment. Anyway, give us one last story before we have to go to break.
You mentioned a couple of, you mentioned military leaders. We have military leaders, they just hold such, they should be esteemed more in this nation.
Yeah.
And they do so much great stuff. For example, we always have a tradition at the society, not only having the military leadership, but the present sitting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sits and leads 2.3 million American men and women in the armed services. So we've had all different types of interesting individuals, such as General Richard Myers, who's him and his wife Jo are two of the most humble individuals. And being an American, we should be proud and really, really pay these people back, you know, what they really deserve. These leaders, they make less than $200,000 a year.
Right.
And it's just really, really incredible. But anyway, General Richard Myers told me a funny story once that I was telling him, I said, Dick, was it tough to actually transition to the private sector? And he said, it's actually funny. He says, General Eisenhower, when he was retired, when he stepped down as Supreme Allied Commander, he actually picked up the phone And he said to his assistant, he said, "There's the phone's acting up." And the assistant said, "No, General Eisenhower, that's the dial tone."
Oh my gosh!
So anyway,
well, they may not make much money comparatively, but they have a big empire to run.
It's always a
now,
tough
Joe, tell us, how do we find you on the web? You've got a great website.
It's just HudsonUnionSociety.com. Anybody is welcome, and you could touch, feel, question, challenge all these great leaders on a regular basis. If you're interested in business leaders, just foreign policy, we have all the great leaders on a regular basis.
Well, I think it's great. I can't wait to come to the next one. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. And that's been Joe Pascal, who's president of the Hudson Union Society. It's HudsonUnionSociety.org. Go to the website and check it out. Thanks. We'll be back in just a minute.